Public transit has its age-old debates: trams versus buses, elevated and underground. But perhaps no debate is quite as contentious, even among people who don't watch transit YouTube videos, as the one between zone fares and flat fares. So let's talk about the facts and how these different fare models stack up, as well as how we can drive towards the ideal fare system for a transit network. Hi, my name's Reece and I make videos about transit and the tickets you use to ride it. So what is a flat versus a zone fare? Well, it's all in the name. A flat fare system is one where you pay a single price to go as far as you want within a system. It's flat. The best example of a flat fare system is the New York City subway, where once you tap into the system, you don't have to tap again and you can go as far as you want. There is no tap out at the other end of your journey when you're exiting the station because the length of your journey doesn't matter. Contrast this with a zone-based fare system, like the one used in London. In London, you tap in both when you enter the station at the beginning of your journey and at the end of your journey when you exit the station, and then your fare is calculated based on how many concentric zones you cross during your trip. The difference between these systems is perhaps most stark when you look at long journeys. In New York, you can ride over 50 kilometers from Far Rockaway to the north of the Bronx for just $2.90, the same price as to go a couple blocks in Manhattan. Whereas riding the entire length of the Piccadilly line from Heathrow Terminal 5 to the other station costs significantly more, and you're not even going quite as far. Once you recognize the difference between these two fare models, the New York system feels very freeing. Travel as far as you want with no premiums. Meanwhile, in London, you probably consider the distance of your journey before you set out, because a longer journey is going to cost you significantly more money. Traditionally speaking, the New York flat fare model has been seen as more equitable, since people traveling from far-flung destinations don't have to pay more to travel on public transportation. Unfortunately though, this assumes that every city has the exact same wealth distribution, where people who are less affluent are living further away from the city, which often isn't the case. But it's not quite so simple. If you take transit a lot, having to pay the exact same fare every time you travel might not actually be very fair. Especially since most trips people take aren't going to be spanning the entire city. New York's model actually seems very well adapted for the 9-to-5 commuter who heads into the city in the morning and out in the evening and has to pay a flat fare 2 times. Compare this to someone who might go into the city in the morning for school and then go to a gym and then go to work and then go out with friends and then go back home. This person might not travel as long as that commuter making 2 trips, but they're going to pay way more fares. And flat fares can be kind of sneaky as well. For example, Paris has flat fares on the metro, which mostly serves the affluent city center. But the second you want to travel into the suburbs on the RER, there's a zonal fare system. That means people who mostly travel by metro get to travel as much as they want on a single fare, while people traveling out into the suburban zones need to pay more and more to go further and further. Truth be told, the real difference isn't between flat and zonal systems, but between flat and pure distance-based fares. A purely distance-based fare system is one where the fare is calculated based on a complex table that looks at the distance between any given pair of stations. Traveling between any 2 stations is often going to cost a different amount based on the different distances between the different stations. And that means as you travel along, every station you go incrementally increases the fare price a little bit. So as it turns out, the zone system is really a hybrid between flat fares and a purely distance-based system. With a zone system, you effectively have a local flat fare area, which is your zone, and then distance-based fares over longer distances, but in bigger increments because you have zones rather than individual stations. Put another way, a fully distance-based fare system is effectively like a zone system where every station gets its own zone. Now, to many, myself included, fully distance-based fares seem like a good system. You pay for exactly how far you travel, the same way that someone with a car pays for exactly how much fuel or electricity they use. But the problem here is this system can make using transit and buying a ticket quite challenging, since it needs to be between 2 particular destinations. This system is particularly challenging because a lot of people have a couple stations that might be near them, and so if you want to travel between the stations around you to various other stations, you might have to calculate tons of different fare combinations to figure out how much you're actually going to have to pay. A complexity that wouldn't exist with a zonal fare system. So because of the complexity and sort of persnickety-ness of an entirely distance-based fare system, if you want to do battle with cars, a zonal fare system seems like the more simple option. But zones aren't perfect, at least not vanilla zones, and that's for reasons that you realize almost immediately if you start living in a city that has fare zones. You see, in a zone-based system, there's frequently people who end up losing out because they live near the edge of a fare zone, and thus, to travel a short distance, they might have to pay an incrementally much higher fare. This can create a lot of problems with the logic of the fare system because sometimes someone can pay less to travel in one direction than another because one direction is within a zone and one direction crosses a boundary. This can be fixed in some cities where there are strong natural divides, like in Montreal, for example, where there is a river around the island that defines one of the fare zones. But those divides don't always exist, and with a purely distance-based fare system, if you travel less far, you pay less money. That being said, this issue with zone-based fares can be fixed fairly easily by giving people a higher than one zone base fare. So instead of having the option to buy a fare that is just a single zone, everyone has to pay for a minimum of 2 zones. And that means people living near a boundary can always travel at least a little while in any direction without crossing the second barrier and having to pay incrementally more. But I imagine you come here because Reece, just tell us the best system. But the reality is there isn't a best system. There are many options. Every fare system has benefits and trade-offs. As I said earlier, I think it's often touted that flat fare systems are more equitable or fair, but I think that's rarely the case. The reality is that traveling over long distances on a flat fare never makes sense because the difference in trip length between one person and another is going to be so great. And so in a lot of places with flat fares like Toronto and New York, what you really end up getting is a flat urban fare and then drastically higher fares for suburban trips, and often much less organization because it's a de facto zonal system, not an actual zonal system with predefined zones. Instead of being able to say, hey, this is a trip from zone 1 to zone 4, it's, hey, this is a trip from the New York subway to the Long Island Railroad to a local transport operator, and it just becomes extremely confusing. On the other hand, fully distance-based fare systems fall prey to making transit a bit too complex and costly to use. It isn't a bad idea to give people a little more flexibility with their travels, allowing them to go from anywhere within one zone to anywhere within another zone, traveling from one general area to another. And so I think I and a lot of other people have landed on the idea that big zones, low fares, and a strong incentive to buy a pass are the best system for transit fares. Such a system is basically what exists in Berlin, where everything within the Ringbahn and the Ringbahn itself are the inner zone, everything on the inner suburbs is the second zone, and the third zone makes out the outer suburbs and the airport. This system does a ton of things right. It allows you to travel on any transit mode within the zones you've paid for, except for high-speed trains, from any operator. It also incentivizes local trips while making longer trips incrementally more expensive. And probably most importantly, it provides affordable passes, so most people are on a pass and don't really have to think about where they can travel or where they can't travel on a day-to-day basis. Montreal has actually adopted a similar zonal fare system to Berlin in recent years, it's just implemented in a much messier way. And that's a good reminder that zonal fare systems can often act a lot like flat fare systems. Montreal feels like a flat fare system for a lot of people, because the island of Montreal, where a lot of people live, is entirely within one zone. In cities like London or Toronto, monthly passes effectively don't exist, which means everyone generally gets charged for every single trip. Kind of the same issue that divides distance-based and a zonal fare system. In both a zonal fare system and in a transit system that focuses on passes rather than single fares, you sort of give something for free to the riders. Extra trips to encourage them to use public transit because we acknowledge that's a good thing. That's why the model used in Berlin and so many other cities around the world is so good. It encourages a predictable flow of revenue for the transport operator because people are encouraged to buy passes, but it also encourages people to use transit a lot, because once you have the pass, you might as well get your money's worth. Of course, this system only works because the passes aren't too expensive. The second you have to start calculating whether a pass is worth it or not, people stop getting passes and that predictability is completely gone. At the same time, by not completely abandoning the zonal system, Berlin's fare system means that people think about how far they're traveling and try to live closer to their destination. While in London, it's used to try to control congestion in the dense city centre by encouraging travellers to avoid Zone 1, the city centre, by giving them orbital transit options like the Overground and lower fares. Essentially, the fare models in Berlin and London are a bit more honest about the transport capacity and the density of the cities. It costs more to build infrastructure in the city centre, and it costs more for transit operators to run trains out into the suburbs, and so passengers paying a little more for these journeys does make sense. And I think the effect that these zone systems have on people's mental perception of the city is helpful as well. It encourages people to think twice about living in some far-flung suburb because they'll have to pay more on the train to get into the city. Because of this, people in London and Berlin often think about the city in terms of what transit fare zone they're in. For example, in Berlin, being inside the Ringbahn and being kind of in the city centre in Zone A, and in London, being in central areas is being in Zones 1 or 2. Of course, ultimately no fare system is perfect, but understanding the inherent flaws and trade-offs of different systems can help you push for better in your own city. It's really valuable to understand how fares in Berlin both encourage density but don't punish people for using transit a lot. And that can help us create transit systems which are more usable and more attractive for riders. Thanks for watching.